and the conflicts that are inherent in that in social work practice, and the social work values and ethics that go along with that. One of the things that I asked you to do in the opening for the week was to kind of think about the idea of ethics and ethical standards from a critical point of view. So, we've already looked at the NASW Code of Ethics, but I think in all ethical dilemmas, it's important to really look at it critically. And it's also, I think, important to look at it with a cultural lens to see what might be considered an ethical issue within one culture may not be considered an ethical issue in another. So I'll give an example of that, illustrate an example of that. When I worked for the state of California as a social worker, it was considered absolutely an ethical violation if I were to take any sort of gift or anything from a client. And that would include a cup of coffee or if I was at a home visit and somebody offered me a cup of coffee or a pastry or something like that, it would have been considered inappropriate and unethical to accept that. In contrast to that, when I worked for the local tribal community, if I went to somebody's home and they offered me food or they offered me drink, it would have actually been considered an ethical violation. Maybe that's too strong of a word, an ethical violation, but it would have not been culturally appropriate to refuse that. And in fact, it would have been most appropriate to accept something like that. So it's important as we talk about these concepts to always think about them in a very personal way in terms of how your own ethical principles and standards, but also to look at them in terms of the setting that you're in, the community that you're in, and the cultural values that need to be integrated when you're making your ethical decisions. I will say that regardless of what those dilemmas are, I think the greatest tool that we have as social workers are the use of our peers when we're evaluating what is an ethical violation or what is an ethical dilemma that we might be dealing with. And so this is where the use of supervision or the use of connecting with your peers around a dilemma that you're dealing with can be particularly useful. So again, the key ideas when we're talking about ethics and values are that conflicts often exist between social work values and ethical standards. That's just a given. When you're working as a social worker, you are going to definitely come against some sort of ethical dilemma. And that ethical decision-making processes can help social workers navigate these ethical dilemmas. And so we're going to look at some of the ways of doing that. And I will put the caveat that this is kind of coming from a Western values perspective. And so please keep that in mind as we explore them. So there are two different kinds of major conflict and dilemmas. The first is a values conflict, where an individual's first personal values clash with those of another person or system. So I can think of many examples of this, but one of those examples would be, let's say your personal values are against are that you believe that abortion should be illegal, or that you personally believe that abortion is murder. But you might be working with a client who is asking for your help in accessing that service, or has questions about that, or needs to process it. So, and I can think of lots of other examples of that. So, we all have our own personal values and ethics, or maybe this could be around certain child-rearing practices that you might think are okay or not okay, and they might clash with the values of another system or person that you're working with. The other is an ethical dilemma, that's when a person holds two or more values that compete with each other. So you'll often find that. So let's say you hold the value of autonomy, but you also hold the value of safety. And so those dilemmas can often come into conflict with one another. So when we look at Dolgoff and the ethical principles screening tool, we look at, there's 7 major principles to kind of think about and adhere to when you're looking at at ethics. The first principle is protection of life. The second principle is equity and inequality. The third principle is autonomy and freedom. The fourth is causing the least harm in any situation. The fifth is quality of life. The sixth is privacy and confidentiality. And the seventh is truthfulness and full disclosure. Let's look at the Reamer steps in ethical decision making. And this is kind of a guide for how you can process and move through ethical decision making. First would be to identify the conflicting ethical issues, values, and duties. So to kind of just highlight or to really bring to light what those are. The next is to identify as those who are likely to be affected by the decision. So to really, think about who these decisions are going to be affecting. The next is to identify a possible course of action and then look at the risk and benefits of each course of action. The next is to examine the reasons in favor of or opposed to each action. And the next would be to consult with colleagues and experts about that. And I talked about that earlier, how critical that is, how important that is to consult with colleagues and experts. And in this world and in the social work realm, it's also important to document your decision often. And this is a way to protect yourself as you are dealing with ethical dilemmas and to also protect the people that you're serving. And then to monitor and evaluate your decision. So you might have a decision that you make at one time and then over the course of time realize that you need to modify your decision and that the ethical dilemma or the consequences of that dilemma are so great that you need to change it. Here's another strategy for assessing ethical dilemmas. The one is to research the literature. What does the literature say about this issue and the dilemma that you're dealing with? Again, how critical it is to consult with others, to consult with peers, to consult with other professionals, to consult with supervisors. And next, to consider the following. What is the worst case scenario of the options? And to really think about that and the consequences of that. And then implementing the principles of least harm, justice, and fairness when you're making your decision. And then the clinical and ethical implications of your decision and examining those. And then really looking at the process and the way that process will impact. And then knowing and looking at the barriers to acting. What is preventing you from acting? What are those barriers in this process in dealing with the ethical dilemma? So please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or any concerns. Again, this is a very complex topic, and I hope that we'll have some opportunities with each other to discuss ethical dilemmas that you may have had in the past, ethical dilemmas that you might anticipate as a professional.